Welcome, dear listeners, to another journey through the Atlas archives, where history unfolds like a well-worn map and geography tells stories older than your favourite bedtime book. Tonight, we venture into the heart of Africa, to a land that quite literally lives up to its name, the Central African Republic. Now, before you start wondering if the Founding Fathers simply ran out of creative juice when naming this place, let me assure you that sometimes the most straightforward names hide the most extraordinary tales. Before we begin, if you enjoy drifting through the world with us like this, take a quiet moment to subscribe to the channel, give the video a gentle like, and let us know in the comments what time it is and where in the world you're listening from. It's always a pleasure to see how far these stories travel. Chapter 1: Central African Republic. Geographic Foundation and Ancient Origins. Picture, if you will, a landlocked nation sitting pretty much dead centre on the African continent, like the continent's belly button, though considerably more politically complex and less prone to collecting lint. The Central African Republic, or CAR as it's known to friends and international aid organisations alike, sprawls across approximately 623,000 square kilometres. To put that in perspective, it's roughly the size of Ukraine, though with considerably fewer wheat fields and a completely different relationship with geopolitical drama. Our geographic tale begins with the land itself, because unlike certain countries that shall remain nameless but rhyme with bungalow, the Central African Republic didn't have the luxury of being an island where it could develop in blissful isolation. No, CAR found itself smack dab in the middle of everything, bordered by 6 nations that would influence its destiny in ways both profound and occasionally absurd. To the north lies Chad, to the east sits Sudan, and later South Sudan after that particular geographic divorce was finalised in 2011. The Democratic Republic of Congo forms the southern border, while the Republic of the Congo sits to the southwest. Not to be confused with its democratic cousin, because apparently one Congo wasn't confusing enough for cartographers. Cameroon completes this continental sandwich to the west. Being landlocked in Central Africa is a bit like being the designated driver at a party, where everyone else has geographical access to the ocean. You're essential to the group dynamic, but you're definitely missing out on some of the fun. The landscape reads like nature's rough draft. Vast savannas punctuated by dense forests, rolling hills that couldn't quite decide if they wanted to be mountains, and rivers that meander through the countryside like tourists who've lost their map but are too proud to ask for directions. Much of the country consists of flat or rolling plateau savanna, sitting about 500 metres above sea level, which gives it the pleasant characteristic of being neither dizzyingly high nor oppressively low. It's the geographical equivalent of a comfortable middle manager. The northern regions embrace the Sudano-Guinean zone, where the Sahel meets more verdant lands. The landscape transitions from semi-arid conditions in the northeast to lush tropical forests in the south, creating a country that contains multiple climate zones like a geographical sampler platter. Speaking of elevation, the Kare Mountains, also known as the Yade Massif, rise in the northwest like granite bumps on the landscape, reaching their peak at Mount Naui, the country's highest point at 1,410 metres. Before you start planning your mountaineering expedition, this is roughly the same height as some taller city buildings. Still, Mount Ngawi provides excellent views of surrounding granite plateaus and sandstone formations that characterise the western regions. The eastern border lies along the Congo-Nile watershed, one of those invisible lines that determines whether a drop of rain will eventually reach the Atlantic Ocean via the Congo River system or take the scenic route to the Mediterranean through the Nile. It's geographical trivia that sounds impressive at dinner parties, assuming you attend the sort where people discuss watershed boundaries, which frankly are the best kind of dinner parties. Now, let's explore the circulatory system of this landlocked heart, the rivers. The Ubangi River system dominates southern geography, flowing like the country's liquid highway system. The Ubangi forms much of the border with the Democratic Republic of Congo, created by the confluence of the Uele and Mbomu rivers. Historically, this watery network served as the primary transportation route for everything from trade goods to colonial administrators to the occasional confused hippopotamus. The Ubangi is commercially navigable, though only downstream from Bangui and typically just between July and January, the aquatic equivalent of a seasonal employee. The Sangha River flows through western regions, connecting to the broader Congo River system. Meanwhile, northern waters flow toward Chad through the Uham and Bamingi rivers, which join the Chari River and eventually reach Lake Chad. This gives the Central African Republic the distinction of contributing water to two major African river basins, like a geographical philanthropist sharing its liquid wealth with multiple neighbours. The southern portions are blanketed in dense tropical rainforest that forms part of the Congo Basin, the world's second largest tropical rainforest after the Amazon. This forest covers about 36% of the country's total land area, equivalent to over 22 million hectares of trees that have witnessed more political upheaval than a constitutional convention. The forest isn't just scenery, it's been the economic backbone, geographic definer, and occasional hiding spot for various groups throughout the country's tumultuous history. The diversity is staggering, home to commercially important species like ayus, sepele, and sipo. Names that sound like they should belong to a mystical council of tree elders dispensing woodland wisdom. Unfortunately, deforestation has been increasing, with the rate jumping 71% in 2021 alone. It's as if the trees are playing an unfortunate game of reverse hide-and-seek, where the goal is to disappear faster than anyone can count them. Now, let's talk climate, because nothing says soothing bedtime story quite like meteorological analysis. The Central African Republic enjoys, and I use that term with the optimism of someone describing airline food as nourishing, a tropical climate that splits its personality between two seasons. There's the dry season, running roughly from December to May, when harmattan winds blow down from the Sahara, carrying dust and unfulfilled promises of rain. These winds transform the air into nature's version of a cosmic dust bunny. Then there's the wet season, from May to November, when the skies open up with cosmic water balloon fight enthusiasm, dumping anywhere from 1,000 to 1,800 millimeters of rain annually. Temperature throughout the year maintains the kind of consistency that would make a meteorologist weep with joy. It's always warm. Average temperatures hover around 27 degrees Celsius year-round, roughly 80 degrees Fahrenheit for those clinging to the Imperial measurement system, like a security blanket. This brings us to an amusing geographical fact. Bangui, the capital city, sits atop the focal point of the Bangui magnetic anomaly, one of the largest magnetic anomalies on Earth. This means compasses go slightly haywire in the capital, which seems like an appropriate metaphor for the country's political history. Founded as a French trading post in 1889, Bangui sprawls along the Ubangi River banks like a city that started with good intentions and just kept growing in whatever direction seemed convenient. But let's step back in time to when this land was occupied by peoples whose relationship with the environment was considerably more stable than anything we've seen since. The Central African Republic has been inhabited for at least 8,000 years, with archaeological evidence pointing to early human settlement that would make any real estate developer green with envy. The earliest inhabitants were likely ancestors of today's Aka people, often called pygmy peoples, though that term is increasingly recognized as problematic. These forest-dwelling communities developed sophisticated environmental knowledge that would put most modern survival guides to shame. Around 10,000 years ago, Sahara desertification forced hunter-gatherer societies southward into what is now the Central African Republic. These early residents witnessed the transition from the Green Sahara period to more arid conditions characterizing the region today. They adapted to changing conditions with resilience that modern climate change researchers study with both admiration and desperate hope for applicable lessons. The Neolithic Revolution brought farming to the region, with initial white yam cultivation progressing to millet and sorghum. Before 3000 BCE, African oil palm domestication provided improved nutrition and allowed population expansion. These early Central Africans figured out sustainable agriculture thousands of years before anyone coined permaculture or started selling expensive courses on traditional farming wisdom. Perhaps the most intriguing archaeological evidence comes from the Buar megaliths, scattered across northwestern regions near Buar town. These granite monuments, dating back to approximately 3,500 to 2,700 BCE during the late Neolithic era, represent one of Africa's most mysterious archaeological sites. About 70 groups of megaliths lie in and around Buar, with the tallest stones reaching 5 meters high. Local Jibaya people call them Tajunu, though they were erected thousands of years before the Jibaya arrived around the 1500s. The cooperation necessary to quarry, transport, and erect these massive stones, some weighing several tons, suggests construction by fairly large social units with sophisticated organizational capabilities. The monuments appear oriented toward watercourses or eastward directions, and many contain burial cists, indicating use as elaborate cemetery sites for elite families. This raises the delightful possibility that even in Neolithic Central Africa, people were engaging in competitive grave decoration, proving that the human impulse for impressive final resting places transcends time and culture. These megaliths were constructed by people speaking languages related to the Adamawa Ubangian family, representing cultural sophistication that challenges assumptions about prehistoric Central African societies. UNESCO added the Buar megaliths to the World Heritage Tentative List in 2006, though they remain frustratingly understudied due to ongoing political instability and limited archaeological resources. Around 5,000 years ago, the Great Bantu expansion began reshaping Central Africa's demographic landscape. The Bantu-speaking peoples, originating from the Nigeria-Cameroon border region, began one of history's most significant human migrations. Archaeological and linguistic evidence suggests Bantu-speaking communities reached the Great Central African rainforest by around 2500 BCE, with pioneering groups emerging into savannas by 500 BCE. This expansion wasn't a single coordinated movement, but rather a gradual process of multiple migrations over millennia. The western stream followed the Congo River system southward, while an eastern stream dispersed along what may have been the rainforest's northern edge, possibly following the Ubangi River. These migrations were facilitated by climate change that caused rainforests to recede, creating the Sangha River interval, a 200-mile-wide grassland corridor running north-south through southeastern Cameroon, southern Central African Republic, and northern Republic of Congo. The Bantu-speaking peoples brought agricultural techniques, pottery-making skills, and eventually iron-working technology. Although early models suggested they arrived with iron tools, archaeological evidence shows they didn't master iron smelting until around 400 BCE. Before that, they relied on sophisticated stone tool technologies and polished implements that enabled them to clear forest paths and establish permanent settlements. Interestingly, some of the earliest evidence for iron metallurgy in sub-Saharan Africa comes from Central Africa itself, including areas within modern-day Central African Republic. By 1000 BCE, iron-working technology had revolutionized regional life, providing stronger farming tools, axes, and knives for forest clearing, and weapons that would prove crucial in subsequent political developments. The arrival of Bantu-speaking peoples didn't result in complete population replacement. Instead, there was significant interaction with existing hunter-gatherer populations. The larger Bantu-speaking agricultural communities often absorbed smaller hunter-gatherer groups, with complex intermarriage and cultural exchange patterns. This process created the ethno-linguistic diversity that characterizes Central Africa today, though it also led to marginalization of many indigenous forest peoples, a pattern continuing to influence contemporary social dynamics. By the first millennium BCE, the Central African Republic was home to numerous small-scale societies practicing mixed agriculture, ironworking, and complex trade relationships. These communities lived in what archaeologists term relatively isolated small settlements, where they hunted and cleared land for cultivation, using slash-and-burn methods that maintained forest cover, while providing agricultural space. Their intimate ecological knowledge enabled sustainable practices that supported stable populations for centuries. The region also saw development of more complex political entities. Archaeological evidence points to the emergence of what would later become kingdoms and chiefdoms, though specific details remain frustratingly elusive due to limited excavation and ongoing security concerns. What we do know suggests sophisticated social organization, long-distance trade networks, and cultural practices that would influence the region for millennia. As we conclude this geographic and ancient foundation of Central African Republic's story, we're left with a picture of a land shaped by its central position, blessed and cursed by its rivers and forests, and home to peoples whose ingenuity and adaptability enabled them to thrive in one of Africa's most challenging environments. The stones of Buar still stand as silent testimony to sophisticated ancient societies, while the forests and savannas continue to harbour descendants of both Bantu farmers and forest-dwelling hunter-gatherers whose ancestors first called this land home. Chapter 2: Colonial Encounters and French Rule. As the 19th century drew to its dramatic close, the indigenous societies of Central Africa found their world about to be turned upside down by visitors who arrived carrying maps, treaties, and an unshakable belief that they had the right to redraw geography to suit European convenience. The story of European colonialism in what would become the Central African Republic reads like a particularly unfortunate blend of adventure novel and economic treatise, with significantly more tragedy than either genre typically allows. The late 1800s marked the height of what historians euphemistically call the scramble for Africa, though scramble hardly captures the systematic nature of European powers carving up an entire continent like dinner guests dividing the last piece of cake. Belgium, Great Britain, Germany, and France competed for control of equatorial Africa, with the enthusiasm of children fighting over toys, except these particular toys happened to be inhabited by millions of people whose opinions on the matter were considered irrelevant to the proceedings. France had grand ambitions for Central Africa, driven by what could charitably be called geographical romanticism and less charitably described as imperial greed. The French dreamed of linking their territories from the Atlantic to the Nile, creating a transcontinental empire that would stretch across Africa like a colonial belt. This vision required controlling the heart of the continent, which put the future Central African Republic squarely in French crosshairs, a position about as comfortable as it sounds. Enter Pierre Savognin de Bretza, a figure who managed to embody both the best and most problematic aspects of European exploration. Born Pietro Paolo Savognin de Bretza in Rome in 1852, he was an Italian count who joined the French Navy and became the poster boy for what the French press dubbed peaceful conquest. De Bretza represented a kinder, gentler form of colonialism, which was rather like advertising a vegetarian option at a barbecue restaurant, well-intentioned perhaps, but fundamentally missing the point. De Bretza's approach to exploration differed markedly from his contemporaries. While others arrived with military expeditions and threatening displays of European technology, de Bretza travelled with small parties, relied on diplomacy, and distributed gifts rather than ultimatums. His expeditions in the 1870s and 80s emphasized negotiation with local rulers, creating treaties through persuasion rather than force. This earned him the romantic nickname Le Conquérant Pacifique, the Peaceful Conqueror, a title that managed to be both admiringly French and oxymoronic in equal measure. The establishment of French presence in the region began in earnest in 1889, when the French explorer Michel d'Olicy founded a post on the Ubangi River at what would become Bangui. This location, near the confluence of the Ubangi and Imperial rivers, was chosen for its strategic value as a launching point for further expeditions into the continental interior. The founding of Bangui on June 25, 1889, marked the beginning of systematic French penetration into what would become Ubangi Shari. The early years of French expansion were marked by both diplomatic successes and violent resistance. Local commanders Maurice Musy and Paul Comte were both killed during combat with indigenous populations in 1890, suggesting that not everyone was enthusiastic about the French civilizing mission. Despite these setbacks, the French continued their expansion, moving north toward Chad and east toward the Nile River throughout the 1890s. By 1894, diplomatic agreements had fixed the borders between French Congo, Leopold II's Congo Free State, and German Cameroon. The French found themselves in possession of a vast territory that would eventually include Ubangi Shari, Chad, Gabon, and Middle Congo. The only problem, and it was a rather significant one, was that France had no idea how to pay for governing, developing, or even properly occupying this enormous acquisition. The solution they devised would have profound and largely catastrophic consequences for the indigenous population. Taking inspiration from King Leopold II's concessionary companies in the Congo Free State, the French government decided to lease large tracts of land to private European companies. In 1899, 17 private companies received massive concessions throughout the Ubangi Shari region, essentially outsourcing colonial administration to businesses whose primary concern was profit rather than welfare. These concessionary companies operated under a system that was brutal even by colonial standards. In exchange for the right to exploit their assigned territories by buying local products and selling European goods, the companies promised to pay rent to the colonial state and promote development of their concessions. In practice, this meant they employed European and African agents who used what contemporary sources politely called extremely brutal and atrocious methods to force Central Africans to work for them without pay. The company's business model was elegantly simple and horrifyingly effective. They forced local populations to harvest rubber, coffee, ivory, and other commodities without compensation, holding family members hostage until workers met their quotas. Meanwhile, the French colonial administration imposed taxes and demanded free labour from the same populations, creating a system where Central Africans were simultaneously exploited by both private companies and the colonial state. At the same time that European companies were establishing their brutal grip on the economy, the region faced another devastating disruption: the expansion of slave trading. Arabic-speaking slave traders had begun extending Trans-Saharan and Nile River trade routes into Central Africa during the 17th century, but the advent of European colonialism actually intensified rather than diminished this trade. Local rulers, taking advantage of their treaties with the French to procure more weapons, increased their slave-raiding activities throughout the first decade of the 20th century. One of the most formidable opponents to French expansion was Rabbi az-Zubayr, a former Egyptian soldier turned warlord who had established a powerful empire across Central Africa. From 1879 to 1891, Rabbi and his forces operated throughout what is now the Central African Republic and southern Chad. He had built a considerable military force of about 5,000 men, with 44 pieces of light artillery, making him a serious obstacle to French ambitions in the region. The French finally defeated Rabbi's forces at the Battle of Kuseri in 1900, but they didn't consolidate control over Ubangi until 1903. The establishment of colonial administration brought new forms of systematic exploitation. The French imposed a head tax on all adult males, payable in either cash or forced labour. Since cash was virtually non-existent in most rural areas, this effectively meant that every adult male owed weeks of unpaid work to the colonial state annually. When news of the worst atrocities reached France, it occasionally caused public outcry. The French writer André Gide published Voyage au Congo in 1925, exposing the continuing atrocities committed against Central Africans by companies like the Forestry Company of Sangha Ubangi. His revelations led to investigations and what he diplomatically called some feeble attempts at reform. But the situation on the ground in Ubangi remained essentially unchanged. The most significant challenge to French colonial rule came in the form of the Congo-Wara Rebellion, which began in 1928 and continued for several years. This uprising was led by Baka Ngainumbe, known as Kanu, a Gabaya religious prophet and healer from the Sangha River Basin region. Kanu began preaching non-violent resistance against the French colonizers in 1924, responding specifically to the brutal recruitment of natives for construction of the Congo Ocean Railway and rubber tapping operations. Kanu's message was both spiritual and practical. He distributed small hooked sticks that resembled miniature hoe handles, Congo-Wara in the local language, to his followers as symbols of traditional medicine's power to overthrow French and Fulani authority. The movement grew to include a boycott of European merchandise and promoted what could be termed early Pan-African solidarity. By 1927, over 350,000 people had joined the movement, including around 60,000 potential warriors. Such unity was unprecedented in a region historically known for its political fragmentation and lack of centralized authority. The scale of the movement testified to the depth of resentment against colonial exploitation and the appeal of Kanu's message of liberation through traditional means. When peaceful resistance transitioned to armed conflict in mid-1928, it caught the French administration largely unprepared. The rebellion began with clashes between Kanu's followers and Fula pastoralists between the towns of Babua and Buar, followed by attacks on Hausa merchant caravans near Gankombon. The violence spread rapidly throughout western and southwestern Ubangi, extending into neighbouring parts of French Cameroon and southern Chad. French authorities found themselves facing what was possibly the largest anti-colonial rebellion in Africa during the interwar period. The mystical aspects of the rebellion presented particular challenges for French forces. Carnot had convinced his followers that the sacred hoe handles would make them invulnerable to European weapons, leading unmilitarized villagers to fight with extraordinary bravery but tragic recklessness. French records describe incidents of rebels dancing before colonial commanders while chanting "Fire, big gorilla, your gun will only shoot water," believing their traditional medicine would protect them from bullets. The French response was characteristically brutal. They launched a counterattack with reinforced troops in late 1928, killing Carnot on December 11th during a military patrol. However, his death failed to end the rebellion, which continued to spread throughout the region. French forces imprisoned followers of the movement and relocated entire populations to designated villages where they could be more easily supervised. The final phase of the conflict, known as the War of the Caves, took place in 1931 as rebels retreated to remote forest areas and cave systems. Perhaps most tellingly, the extent of the Congo-Wara rebellion was carefully hidden from the French public because it provided embarrassing evidence of strong opposition to colonial rule and forced labour. Unlike other colonial conflicts, the rebellion was relegated to relative obscurity in France, with few politicians or commentators acknowledging its significance. The rebellion did achieve some improvements in colonial administration, though these were primarily motivated by French self-interest rather than humanitarian concern. Authorities agreed not to renew the leases of the most egregious concessionary companies, though European business interests continued to dominate the regional economy. The worst forms of forced labour were reduced, partly because the rebellion demonstrated that excessive brutality could provoke organised resistance. Meanwhile, World War I brought additional complications to colonial rule. In 1911, the Sangha and Lobaye basins were ceded to Germany as part of an agreement giving France free rein in Morocco. Western Ubangi Shari thus came under German rule until World War I, during which France reconquered the territory using Central African troops. The irony of forcing colonized Africans to fight for the restoration of their own colonial subjugation was apparently lost on French administrators. The interwar period saw gradual changes in colonial policy, driven as much by practical necessity as humanitarian considerations. A network of roads was built to facilitate economic exploitation and administrative control. Mobile health services were created to combat sleeping sickness and other diseases that threatened the labour force. Roman Catholic churches established schools and medical clinics, though these were primarily designed to create a compliant, educated elite, rather than promote genuine development. The French also began promoting cash crops like coffee, cotton, and tea, while granting monopolies to large companies that fixed prices in their favour. Diamond and gold mining operations commenced, though profits flowed almost exclusively to European shareholders. The colonial economy remained fundamentally extractive, designed to benefit France rather than improve conditions for Central Africans. As the 1940s approached, the seeds of eventual independence were beginning to germinate, though they would take decades to flower. World War II would bring new complications and opportunities, as colonial subjects who served in European armies returned home with expanded horizons and diminished deference to white authority. The French colonial period in Central Africa had established patterns of exploitation, resistance, and adaptation that would profoundly influence the region's subsequent development. The concessionary company system had created economic structures designed to extract maximum profit with minimal investment in local development. The brutal suppression of the Congo-Wara rebellion had demonstrated both the limits of traditional resistance and the potential for mass mobilization against colonial rule. The transformation of Ubangi Shari into a French colony represented one of the most dramatic social reorganizations in the region's history. Traditional political structures were systematically dismantled or co-opted to serve colonial purposes. Local chiefs who collaborated with French authorities were retained and rewarded, while those who resisted found themselves replaced by more compliant alternatives. This created lasting divisions within communities that would persist long after independence. Cultural changes accompanied political and economic transformation. French became the language of administration and education, while indigenous languages were marginalized in formal settings. The introduction of Western customs created new forms of social stratification based on proximity to European culture. Those Central Africans who mastered French language and customs gained access to colonial employment, while the majority remained trapped in subsistence agriculture or forced labour. By the 1930s, the basic structures of French colonial rule were firmly established. Ubangi had been integrated into French Equatorial Africa alongside Chad, Gabon, and Middle Congo. A colonial administration headquartered in Brazzaville governed the federation, while local administrators in Bangui managed day-to-day affairs. The territory was divided into administrative districts that often cut across traditional ethnic boundaries. As we prepare to explore the transition toward independence, we see in French colonial rule a system that combined paternalistic rhetoric with economic exploitation, technological development with cultural destruction, and promises of civilization with systematic brutality. The legacy of this period would continue to shape Central African politics, economics, and society long after the French flag was finally lowered for the last time. Chapter 3: Independence, Struggles, and Early Statehood. The 1940s opened with the world at war, and the people of Ubangi about to discover that global conflicts have a peculiar way of reshaping local destinies. World War II would prove to be an unexpected catalyst for political change in French Central Africa, though not in ways that anyone could have anticipated when the first German bombs began falling on Warsaw. The path from colonial subject to independent citizen rarely follows a straight line, and in the case of the Central African Republic, it resembled more of a serpentine dance between pragmatism and idealism, with frequent stumbles along the way. When France fell to Germany in June 1940, the French Empire suddenly found itself divided between those territories that accepted Marshal Pétain's Vichy government and those that rallied to General Charles de Gaulle's Free French movement. This split presented colonial administrators and African subjects alike with an impossible choice: remain loyal to the established French authority now collaborating with Nazis, or support a rogue general broadcasting from London who promised to restore French honour but had no territory, no government, and no apparent means of achieving his grandiose objectives. French Equatorial Africa, including Ubangi would play a crucial role in this drama, though historians have only recently begun to appreciate just how pivotal Central Africa was to de Gaulle's survival and eventual success. In late August 1940, when the Free French needed legitimacy more than anything else, they found it not in London's drawing rooms but in the vast territories spanning from the Congo River to the Sahara Desert. Charles de Gaulle himself would later acknowledge that Free France was fundamentally African rather than European in its early incarnation. The key figure in this transformation was Félix Éboué, the remarkable black Guyanese governor of Chad who became the first colonial administrator to rally to de Gaulle's cause. On July 3, 1940, Éboué wrote to de Gaulle expressing his desire to continue fighting the Germans, and on August 26th he officially proclaimed Chad's adherence to Free France. This single act provided de Gaulle with actual territory to govern, transforming him from an exile with a radio microphone into the head of a functioning, if geographically unlikely, French state. The domino effect was swift and decisive. On August 27th, Philippe Leclerc de Hautecloque landed in Douala and took control of Cameroon for the Free French. The next day, French Congo joined the movement under Colonel de Lamena, followed immediately by Ubangi on August 29th. Within a matter of days, de Gaulle controlled a territory larger than the continental United States, stretching from the Atlantic Ocean to the borders of Italian Libya. Brazzaville became the capital of Free French Africa, and for all practical purposes, the capital of Free France itself, until 1943. For the people of Ubangi this meant immediate and dramatic changes to daily life. The territory suddenly found itself on the front lines of a global conflict, contributing soldiers, resources, and strategic geography to the Allied cause. Young men like Paul Kudusaranye from Bimbo enlisted in the 2nd Battalion of Tirailleurs of Ubangi becoming part of the first military units to serve Free France. These battalions would go on to distinguish themselves in the Battle of Bir Hakeim and other crucial engagements, earning recognition as some of the finest soldiers in de Gaulle's forces. The transformation of sleepy colonial backwater into strategic military base brought both opportunities and hardships. The Free French needed everything: soldiers, labourers, raw materials, and infrastructure. Roads were built at breakneck speed to connect Bangui with Chad and facilitate military operations against Axis forces in Libya. The Douala-Bangui Fort Lamy axis became a crucial supply line for the Western Desert Campaign. while new transportation networks opened previously isolated regions to outside contact and influence. However, this wartime mobilization also intensified colonial exploitation. The demand for resources led to forced labor recruitment, reminiscent of the worst abuses of the concessionary company period. Rubber production increased dramatically to supply Allied needs, often through methods that differed little from the brutal practices that had sparked the Congo War rebellion. The irony was inescapable. Africans were being coerced to provide forced labor for a movement supposedly dedicated to fighting fascist oppression. Charles de Gaulle visited Brazzaville in October 1940 and established the Empire Defense Council to coordinate Free French territories. This marked the beginning of recognition that the African colonies were political entities with their own interests and aspirations. The experience of governing actual territory forced de Gaulle to confront questions about the future relationship between France and its colonies that he had previously avoided. The war years also saw the emergence of a new generation of African leaders who gained political experience and confidence through their participation in the Free French movement. These men had witnessed French vulnerability and incompetence firsthand, seen European powers fighting each other with desperate ferocity, and learned that the colonial system was far from the unshakable natural order it pretended to be. When Central African soldiers returned from North Africa and Italy, they brought with them expanded horizons and diminished deference to white authority. Among these rising figures was Barthélemy Boganda, who had become the single most important political leader in Central African history. Born in 1810 in Bobangui, Boganda experienced a childhood that could have been scripted as a colonial morality tale. Orphaned at a young age, he was adopted and educated by Catholic missionaries who recognized his exceptional intelligence. He excelled in his studies, and in 1938 became the first Central African ordained as a Roman Catholic priest. The war years transformed Boganda from dutiful parish priest into political activist. Serving in various missions during the conflict, he witnessed contradictions between Christian teachings about human dignity and colonial oppression. When the Bishop of Bangui encouraged him to enter politics after the war, Boganda was ready for the challenge. In November 1946, he became the first Central African elected to the French National Assembly. In the French National Assembly, Boganda quickly established himself as an eloquent and uncompromising opponent of racism and colonial abuse. He spoke out against the continuation of forced labour, the arbitrary power of colonial administrators, and the economic exploitation that kept Africans impoverished while enriching European companies. His speeches were notable not only for their moral clarity, but for their sophisticated understanding of French law and republican principles, making it difficult for his opponents to dismiss him as an uninformed agitator. However, Boganda's true political genius lay in his ability to build a mass movement that transcended traditional ethnic and religious divisions. On September 28, 1949, he founded the Movement for the Social Evolution of Black Africa, known as Mesan. The party's founding manifesto called for unity among all the blacks of the world, while promoting the political, economic and social evolution of Black Africa. Mesan was deliberately designed as both a political party and a quasi-religious movement, drawing on Boganda's clerical background and African spiritual traditions. The party's central philosophy was zo kwe zo, meaning every human being is a person, a deceptively simple statement that challenged fundamental assumptions of colonial rule. This phrase would eventually be incorporated into the national coat of arms and constitution. Boganda's political strategy was carefully calibrated to achieve maximum impact while avoiding the violent confrontation that had doomed earlier resistance movements like the Congo War rebellion. Rather than demanding immediate independence, he called for equal treatment and civil rights for Africans within the French Union, a position that was radical enough to inspire his followers, while remaining sufficiently moderate to avoid triggering brutal suppression by colonial authorities. Mason's rapid growth alarmed both French administrators and European settlers, who recognized that Boganda represented a far more sophisticated threat than any previous African leader. The territorial administration established branches of the Rassemblement du Peuple Français to oppose Mason, while French business interests funded competing political organizations. However, these efforts proved largely futile against Boganda's combination of charisma, organizational skill, and genuine popular appeal. The party's success became undeniable in the 1957 Territorial Assembly elections, when Mesan captured 347,000 of the 356,000 votes cast, winning every legislative seat. This electoral landslide positioned Bokassa as the undisputed leader of Ubangi and gave him a mandate that even the most recalcitrant colonial officials could not ignore. The 1956 Loi Cadre reforms had transferred significant powers to territorial governments, replacing the dual college system with universal suffrage. Bokansa's overwhelming victory made him president of the Grand Council of French Equatorial Africa and positioned him to influence the entire federation. His vision extended beyond his own territory to encompass a unified Central African state including Chad, Gabon, Congo, and Cameroon. However, Bokansa's federal dreams encountered resistance from leaders in other territories. When Charles de Gaulle proposed the French Community in 1958, offering territories internal autonomy while maintaining association with France, Bokassa supported joining after receiving assurances that membership would not preclude later independence. The constitutional referendum resulted in strong endorsement, and Ubangi became an autonomous republic with Bokassa as Prime Minister in December 1958. Tragically, Bokassa would not live to see independence. On March 29, 1959, his airplane crashed, killing him instantly. Many suspected sabotage by French interests opposed to independence, though the official investigation attributed it to pilot error. His death deprived the independence movement of its most capable leader at the crucial transition moment. The succession struggle revealed the fragility of political unity built around Bokassa's personal charisma. David Dacko, his younger cousin, emerged as the victor with French support, taking office as Prime Minister on May 1, 1959. Dacko represented a more conservative strain of nationalism, prioritising good relations with France over ambitious Pan-African projects. On August 13, 1960, Ubangi achieved full independence as the Central African Republic, with Dacko as its first president. The transformation from colonial territory to sovereign nation had taken less than 2 decades from the end of World War II, a remarkably rapid pace of change that reflected both the weakening of European colonial power and the skill of African leaders in exploiting evolving international circumstances. However, independence brought challenges that proved far more complex than the struggle against colonial rule. The new nation lacked trained administrators, adequate infrastructure, a diverse economic base, or strong institutions capable of managing the transition from colonial dependency to self-governance. Most critically, it faced the fundamental question of how to build national unity among diverse ethnic groups that had been artificially combined by colonial boundaries. Dacko's early presidency established patterns that would persist throughout the Republic's troubled history. He quickly moved to consolidate power, making Maysan the only legal political party in 1962 and effectively eliminating organised opposition. This concentration of authority was justified as necessary for national unity and development, but it established precedents for authoritarian rule that would prove difficult to reverse. The economic challenges were equally daunting. The Central African Republic remained dependent on French aid, investment, and technical assistance, while its exports consisted primarily of raw materials, diamonds, cotton, coffee, and timber, that provided little value-added employment or industrial development. The colonial pattern of extractive economics persisted under new management, with profits continuing to flow primarily to external beneficiaries rather than contributing to broad-based national development. Dacko did achieve some notable successes during his first term. He significantly increased diamond production by eliminating the monopoly on mining held by concessionary companies and decreeing that any Central African could dig for diamonds. He also succeeded in having a diamond-cutting factory built in Bangui, representing one of the few attempts at industrial development during this period. These achievements helped diversify the economy slightly and created new sources of government revenue. However, these gains were offset by growing problems in other areas. Dacko expanded the number of government positions to reward his supporters and increased salaries for civil servants, policies that quickly drained the national budget. The administration became increasingly corrupt and inefficient, while the president found himself torn between the need to retain French support and the desire to demonstrate independence in foreign policy. His cultivation of closer relations with the People's Republic of China reflected this tension, as he sought alternative sources of support while maintaining essential ties with France. By 1965, the contradictions in Dacko's policies had created a crisis of governance. The economy was in decline, the national debt had soared, and the government faced impending bankruptcy. A threatened nationwide strike by unpaid civil servants highlighted the administration's inability to fulfill even its most basic obligations. Popular support for Dacko had evaporated, and even his French patrons were beginning to question his competence. The stage was set for the dramatic intervention that would bring to power one of the most notorious figures in African political history. On the night of December 31st, 1965, General Jean Bedel Bokassa, the commander of the army and Dacko's cousin, carried out a bloodless coup that would plunge the Central African Republic into a period of increasingly bizarre and brutal autocracy. The end of Dacko's first presidency marked not only the failure of the country's initial experiment with democratic governance, but also the beginning of a descent into the kind of personalized dictatorship that would become all too familiar in post-independence Africa. As the early years of independence gave way to military rule, it became clear that the euphoria of flag ceremonies and constitutional conventions had obscured the fundamental challenges of nation-building in a post-colonial context. The Central African Republic's experience illustrated both the possibilities and the limitations of the decolonization process, demonstrating that political independence was merely the beginning, rather than the end, of the struggle for genuine self-determination and social transformation. Chapter 4. The Bokassa Era and Imperial Madness. As 1965 drew to a close, David Dacko's government teetered on bankruptcy, civil servants went unpaid, and nationwide strikes threatened to paralyze the Central African Republic. Into this chaos stepped a man whose name would become synonymous with imperial delusion and brutal excess, Jean Bedel Bokassa. Born February 22, 1921, in Ubangi village, Bokassa's early life was marked by tragedy. His father, a Mbaka village chief, was murdered by French colonial officials in November 1927 for refusing to provide forced labourers. A week later, his mother committed suicide. 6-year-old Jean Bedel became an orphan in a world ruled by those who had destroyed his family. Catholic missionaries at École Sainte-Jeanne d'Arc took in the traumatized child, where he first encountered the grandeur and ceremony that would later captivate his imagination. Frequently taunted by classmates about his orphanhood, he may have developed his later need for absolute adoration. At École Saint-Louis in Bangui, he became fond of a French grammar book by author Jean Bedel. His teachers began calling him Jean Bedel, the name that would grace a self-proclaimed empire. In May 1939, Bokassa joined the French colonial army as a tirailleur. Military life suited him perfectly: the discipline, hierarchy, and badges of honor. Naturally charismatic and physically strong despite his short stature, he possessed an almost supernatural ability to inspire loyalty. When France fell in 1940, he joined de Gaulle's Free French Forces, a decision that shaped his worldview. Bokassa's military career was distinguished. He participated in Operation Dragoon, the Allied landings in Provence, fighting through southern France into Germany. His service in Indochina from September 1950 to March 1953 truly forged his character. As a transmissions expert with the Saigon Cholon Battalion, he saw combat during the First Indochina War, earning France's highest military honours, the Legion of Honor and Croix de Guerre. He married Vietnamese girl Nguyen Thi Huê and had daughter Martine before abandoning them both. After serving in Algeria under Colonel Marcel Bigard, he absorbed 22 years of French military culture, complete with its Napoleonic mystique. When the Central African Republic gained independence, President Dacko faced building a national army from scratch. Bokassa, with his French training and family connections, he was Dacko's cousin and Buganda's nephew, seemed perfect for the job. On January 1st, 1962, he joined the Central African Armed Forces as battalion commander. Within 2 years, Dacko promoted him to the country's first colonel and chief of staff. Tasked with building a 500-strong army, Bokassa threw himself into the role, appearing in public wearing all his French decorations, often sitting beside President Dacko to display his importance. At an official dinner, Dacko famously dismissed coup concerns, saying, "Colonel Bokassa only wants to collect medals and he is too stupid to pull off a coup d'etat." This would prove spectacularly wrong. By 1965, Dacko's government was unravelling. The economy stagnated, bureaucracy collapsed, and the country faced constant incursions. Daco's establishment of relations with Communist China alarmed his French patrons. On New Year's Eve 1965, Bokassa struck with the Saint-Sylvestre coup, a masterpiece of military precision. By dawn, Daco was in custody, and Bokassa had proclaimed himself president. "My dear compatriots," Bokassa announced on Radio Bangui, "I have taken power not for personal ambition, but to save our country from chaos and corruption." He dissolved the National Assembly, suspended the Constitution, and promised elections soon, a promise that would echo unfulfilled for 13 years. Initially, Bokassa's rule brought genuine improvements. Anti-corruption campaigns, army modernization, and development projects flourished. He established a revolutionary council and introduced colourful reforms. Begging was prohibited, morality brigades patrolled streets, and officials attended mandatory fitness classes. These early years suggested he might actually be the strong leader the Central African Republic needed. But absolute power corrupted absolutely. In 1969, he survived a coup attempt and personally beat the ringleader, Alexandre Banza, to death, revealing his darker nature. By 1972, he had declared himself president for life, adorning his chest with dozens of self-created medals. His appetite for ceremony grew with each passing year, fed by the isolation surrounding absolute rulers. The transformation accelerated when Valéry Giscard d'Estaing became French president in 1974. Their relationship was complex. Giscard became a regular hunting partner, visiting Bangui annually while accepting diamond gifts. This connection convinced Bokassa he was destined for greatness, not merely as an African strongman, but as European-style royalty. Obsessed with Napoleon Bonaparte, Bokassa studied the emperor's campaigns and ceremonies with religious devotion. In September 1976, during Gaddafi's visit, he temporarily converted to Islam, changing his name to Salah Eddin Ahmed Bokassa for Libyan financial aid. When funds failed to materialize, he promptly converted back to Catholicism, religious flexibility that would have impressed Renaissance princes. On December 4, 1976, Bokassa made his historic announcement. At an extraordinary Mason Party Congress, standing in a marshal's uniform, he declared the transformation of the Central African Republic into the Central African Empire, with himself as Emperor Bokassa I. His full title became Emperor of Central Africa by the will of the Central African people, united within the national political party, the Mason. For an entire year, Bokassa planned what he intended to be the most spectacular imperial ceremony since Napoleon's coroning. He consulted foreign ambassadors about court protocol and invited Pope John Paul II to crown him. When the Vatican declined and the Catholic Church refused cathedral access, he settled for the basketball stadium hastily renamed Coronation Palace. French artisans crafted his regalia in Paris: velvet robes, golden crown, ivory sceptre, topped with a 9-carat diamond. The 2-ton throne was carved from mahogany and gilded, designed as a giant eagle with outstretched wings. French composers created the Imperial March and Imperial Waltz specifically for the occasion. On December 4, 1977, the coronation finally occurred. Mercedes-Benz limousines carried guests through hastily repaired streets to the transformed basketball stadium. 4,000 people witnessed pure theatre, Bokassa crowning himself in deliberate imitation of Napoleon, then crowning wife Catherine as empress. The spectacle lasted 2 days and cost $20 million, 1/3 of the empire's annual budget. Despite invitations to world leaders including Emperor Hirohito and Idi Amin, only 600 of 2,500 invited foreign guests attended. No major leaders were present, Bokassa commented bitterly. They were jealous of me because I had an empire and they didn't. The truth was simpler. By 1977, most of the international community regarded Emperor Bokassa as either a laughingstock or dangerous madman. The coronation marked not a golden age's beginning, but rapid decline into chaos. The enormous expense bankrupted the empire, leaving civil servants unpaid and services collapsing. Bokassa's behaviour became increasingly erratic, ordering executions from his marble throne, feeding prisoners to crocodiles, and rumours of cannibalism, though this was never definitively proven. The beginning of the end came in January 1979 with Bokassa's fateful school uniform decree. Inspired by Beijing's orderly students and frustrated by poor exam results, he mandated all students wear uniforms designed by him and manufactured by his wife's company. The uniforms cost $165 each, equivalent to several months' wages for most families. When schools turned away children who couldn't afford uniforms, protests erupted. On January 15th, 3,000 students chanted, "Bokassa, pay our student grants." And after the Shah, "Bokassa." Children threw rocks at his passing Rolls-Royce during imperial processions. For a man requiring constant adoration, this public humiliation was unbearable. On April 18th, the Imperial Guard rounded up approximately 180 young people, some as young as 8. What followed at Ngaragba prison became the Bangui Children's Massacre. Children were beaten and crammed into overcrowded cells. At 10 o'clock that night, Emperor Bokassa arrived, screamed at the children for insolence, then began beating boys to death with his ivory-encrusted walking cane, ordering guards to carry on. Over 2 days, approximately 100 children died, shot, clubbed, bayoneted, or asphyxiated in overcrowded cells. Several survived by pretending to be dead among classmates' corpses. These survivors would later provide testimony that brought international attention to Bokassa's regime's full horror. The massacre sent shockwaves worldwide. Amnesty International investigated, governments condemned the killings, and aid was suspended. Most damaging, Bokassa's own ambassador to Paris, General Sylvestre Bangui, resigned and sought French asylum after confirming the massacre occurred. For France, the massacre presented a terrible dilemma. President Giscard had been Bokassa's hunting partner and diamond recipient, a relationship about to explode into the Diamonds Affair scandal. The Franco-African Conference established a commission that concluded in July that Bokassa had almost certainly participated in murdering approximately 100 children. France imposed sanctions, but these only accelerated Bokassa's desperation. Sensing isolation, Bokassa turned to Libya's Gaddafi for support, alarming French intelligence. By September 1979, French patience had run out. While Bokassa was in Tripoli seeking aid, French intelligence launched Operation Cabane, a bloodless coup ending the Central African Empire. On September 19th, French commandos flew exiled David Dacko into Bangui. The operation encountered virtually no resistance, with Bokassa absent and his Imperial Guard demoralized. Shortly before midnight, on September 20th, Dacko broadcast a message denouncing Bokassa and proclaiming the empire's overthrow. By 12:30 on September 21st, the Central African Republic was restored. When Bokassa learned of the coup in Libya, even Gaddafi recognized a lost cause. The self-proclaimed Napoleon of Africa had fallen through a quiet French operation while he was literally out of the country. Bokassa fled first to Ivory Coast, then to France, where his service in the French military entitled him to political asylum. He settled in his Château de Hadricourt in a Parisian suburb, writing memoirs that a French court would later order destroyed because they contained embarrassing revelations about his relationship with President Giscard d'Estaing. For 7 years, he lived in exile, raging against the world that had abandoned him, insisting that he had been a benevolent ruler betrayed by ungrateful subjects. The Bokassa era had lasted 13 years, 11 as president and 3 as emperor, but its impact on the Central African Republic would endure for decades. The country's economy was shattered, its institutions were destroyed, and its international reputation was permanently damaged. Bokassa had taken a poor but stable nation and turned it into a byword for African dictatorship and excess. His coronation had cost more than most African countries' annual budgets, while his people lived in poverty that was among the world's most extreme. Yet perhaps the most tragic aspect of Bokassa's story is how it began with genuine promise. His early years in power had brought real improvements: infrastructure development, anti-corruption campaigns, modernization of the military. He had possessed charisma, intelligence, and organizational skills that could have transformed the Central African Republic into a model of African development. Instead, absolute power had corrupted those talents into a grotesque parody of leadership, turning a potential nation-builder into history's most infamous African emperor. In his final years, Bokassa would return to the Central African Republic, face trial for his crimes, and die in obscurity in 1996. But his legacy lived on in the institutions he had destroyed, the trust he had shattered, and the international perception he had created of African leadership as inherently unstable and corrupt. The crown and sceptre gathering dust in French museums serve as monuments not to imperial glory, but to the dangerous intersection of personal ambition and unlimited power. The story of Emperor Bokassa serves as perhaps the most extreme example of how post-colonial African leaders could transform liberation movements into personal tyrannies. It demonstrates the tragic consequences when the legitimate desire for African dignity and respect becomes twisted into megalomaniacal fantasy. Most of all, it reminds us that the line between visionary leadership and dangerous delusion is often thinner than we imagine, and that the price of crossing that line is always paid by the innocent. Chapter 5. Modern Conflicts and Political Turmoil. On September 21st, 1979, David Dacko stepped off a French military aircraft and back onto Central African soil, returning to a country he had barely recognised. The republic that Bokassa had transformed into his personal empire lay in ruins, economically devastated, politically traumatised, and internationally disgraced. As Dacko surveyed the wreckage of 13 years under the mad emperor, he might have wondered whether anyone could rebuild what had been so thoroughly destroyed. The answer, it would turn out, was both yes and no. The immediate aftermath of Operation Barracuda brought both relief and sobering reality to Central Africa. French paratroopers maintained order in Bangui, while ordinary citizens emerged from years of imperial terror to discover their country bankrupt and their institutions in ruins. The imperial crown and 2-ton golden throne became museum pieces, but the massive debts from Bokassa's coronation ceremony remained very real burdens. Diamond revenues that should have funded development for decades had vanished into Swiss bank accounts, leaving behind only bitter memories and empty treasuries. Dacko's second presidency began with genuine promise, but faced impossible challenges. International donors initially welcomed the return of civilian government, and aid money began flowing again to a country desperate for reconstruction. Civil servants received their first regular paychecks in years, basic services slowly resumed, and political prisoners emerged from Ngarigba prison to tell their stories. For a brief moment, it seemed that the Central African Republic might actually stabilise and begin building the democratic institutions that Barthélemy Baganda had envisioned at independence. Dacko, now in his early 50s and visibly weakened by his years of imprisonment and house arrest, struggled to project the authority necessary for effective governance. His health was poor, his political base had eroded during Bokassa's reign, and younger politicians began circling like vultures around what they perceived as a wounded leader. The man who had once seemed destined to build a modern Central African state now appeared to be little more than a French puppet, maintained in power by foreign bayonets rather than popular support. The economic situation proved particularly intractable. Bokassa's extravagances had left the country with crippling debt, while his neglect of basic infrastructure had left roads impassable, schools without books, and hospitals without medicines. Diamond mining, the backbone of the economy, had been disrupted by years of corruption and mismanagement. Attempts at economic reform moved slowly, hampered by bureaucratic incompetence and the simple reality that there was very little money available for reconstruction projects. The military presented perhaps the greatest threat to political stability. Many officers had served under Bokassa and were tainted by association with his crimes, while others had been passed over for promotion based on ethnic loyalty rather than merit. Soldiers went months without pay, creating discontent that ambitious officers could easily exploit. Young General André Kolingba, whom Dacko had appointed as Army Chief of Staff in July 1981, seemed reliable and professional. This assessment would prove catastrophically wrong. André Dieudonné Kolingba was born on August 12, 1936, in Bangui to a Yakoma family from the riverine communities along the Ubangi River. Like Bokassa before him, he had joined the French military as a young man, serving 8 years before transferring to the Central African Armed Forces at independence. His rise through the ranks had been steady but unspectacular sub-lieutenant in 1964, colonel by the early 70s, and brigadier general in 1973. He had even served briefly as Bokassa's aide-de-camp, demonstrating the same pragmatic loyalty that characterized his entire career. What set Kolingba apart from previous military strongmen was his reputation for quiet competence rather than flashy ambition. He was described by French advisers as straightforward and apolitical, a professional soldier more interested in military efficiency than political power. This reputation for moderation made him seem like an ideal choice for Army Chief of Staff, someone who could rebuild military discipline without threatening civilian authority. Dako's faith in Colingba would soon prove to be another in his long series of political miscalculations. The final crisis of Dako's second presidency came in 1981, when a combination of economic collapse, labour strikes, and political opposition created an atmosphere of impending chaos. Civil servants demanding unpaid wages paralysed government offices, while opposition politicians called for Dako's resignation. Most alarming of all, bomb attacks by small radical groups suggested that political violence was escalating beyond manageable levels. The government seemed to be disintegrating before the nation's eyes. On September 1st, 1981, while President Dako was visiting Libya for an official state visit, General Colingba struck with the same clinical efficiency that had characterized Bokassa's coup 16 years earlier. The operation was bloodless and swift. Key government buildings were occupied, the constitution suspended, and a military committee for national recovery established to govern the country. By the time Dako learned of his overthrow from Libyan television, it was already over. Once again, the Central African Republic had traded civilian government for military rule. Colingba's rise to power was widely believed to have French support, though the exact level of involvement remained murky. What was clear was that the 800 French soldiers stationed in the country had orders not to interfere with the coup, and French military advisor Jean-Claude Mantillon would later be credited with playing a key role in the operation. The new socialist government of François Mitterrand in Paris might not have authorized the coup, but they accepted its results with minimal protest. France's relationship with its former African colonies remained as complex and compromised as ever. The new military regime promised to restore order, eliminate corruption, and eventually return to democratic governance. General Colingba presented himself as a reluctant leader who had intervened only to save the country from chaos and would step aside once stability was restored. These promises sounded remarkably similar to those made by Bokassa in 1966. But international observers hoped that Colingba's more modest personality and professional background might produce different results. They would be only partially correct. Colingba's rule from 1981 to 1993 represented a more conventional form of African authoritarianism, corrupt and repressive, but without the theatrical megalomania that had characterized Bokassa's empire. The Military Committee for National Recovery governed through decree. All political parties were banned, and opposition voices were systematically silenced. But there were no imperial crowns, no cannibalism rumours, and no massacres of schoolchildren. By the grim standards of Central African politics, this constituted progress of sorts. The new regime's most distinctive feature was its systematic ethnic favoritism. Colingba filled key positions in government, military, and state-owned enterprises with fellow Yakoma people, who comprised only about 4% of the national population. This policy of ethnic nepotism was more blatant than anything seen since independence, transforming what had been an ethnically diverse government into essentially a Yakoma tribal administration. Other ethnic groups found themselves frozen out of power and economic opportunities, creating resentments that would fester for decades. Economically, Colingba's rule brought modest improvements compared to the chaos of the Bokassa era, but the fundamental problems remained unresolved. Diamond production recovered somewhat, foreign aid resumed, and basic government services were restored to minimal functionality. However, corruption remained endemic, with revenues routinely diverted to benefit Colingba's ethnic network. The gap between rich and poor widened, while most Central Africans continued to live in poverty that would have been shocking in medieval Europe. The international environment began shifting dramatically in the late 1980s and early 1990s. The end of the Cold War removed much of the strategic justification for supporting African dictatorships, while democratic movements across the continent created pressure for political reform. In 1989, the Berlin Wall fell. By 1991, the Soviet Union had collapsed. Suddenly, France and other Western powers found themselves less willing to tolerate authoritarian allies who served no strategic purpose in the New World Order. Domestic pressure for change also intensified throughout the early 1990s. Labour unions organised strikes demanding both unpaid wages and political reform. Students demonstrated for academic freedom and democratic governance. Professional associations called for an end to military rule and the convening of a national conference to draft a new constitution. Most significantly, in April 1991, the National Labour Federation organised a general strike that paralysed government operations and demonstrated the regime's growing weakness. Faced with mounting domestic unrest and declining French support, Colombo began a gradual retreat from absolute power. In 1985, he had dissolved the military committee and appointed a cabinet with some civilian participation. A new constitution was submitted to referendum in 1986 and approved with an implausible 92% of the vote. Parliamentary elections followed in 1987, though voters were presented with only a single list of candidates from Colombo's newly created party, the Central African Democratic Rally. These cosmetic reforms satisfied no one and actually increased demands for genuine democratization. Opposition leaders pointed out that single-party elections were hardly democratic, while international observers noted that the constitution gave Colombo virtually unlimited executive power. More importantly, the economic crisis continued to worsen, with civil servants going months without pay and basic services deteriorating further. By the early 1990s, it was clear that more substantial changes would be necessary to avoid revolutionary upheaval. The decisive moment came in 1992, when donor countries and international organizations united to demand free and fair elections as a condition for continued aid. The United States ambassador was particularly vocal in pressing for democratic reforms, while the World Bank and International Monetary Fund made financial assistance conditional on political liberalization. Faced with the choice between democratization and economic collapse, Colombo reluctantly agreed to allow opposition parties to organize and compete in presidential elections. The 1993 electoral campaign revealed just how unpopular the military regime had become. Opposition parties emerged from years of underground activity to mobilize massive crowds demanding change. Labor unions endorsed opposition candidates, student organizations campaigned actively for democracy, and even some traditional chiefs threw their support behind civilian challengers. It became clear that Colombo's support was limited primarily to his own ethnic group and those who had benefited directly from military rule. The leading opposition candidate was Ange Félix Patassé, a northerner who had served as prime minister under Emperor Bokassa but had gone into exile during the emperor's final years. Patassé was an experienced politician with a base of support among northern ethnic groups, particularly his own Sarakaba people. His campaign promised national reconciliation, economic development, and an end to ethnic favoritism in government appointments. Most importantly, he represented change from military rule and the possibility of genuine democracy. When the first round of voting was held in August 1993, Colombo finished dead last among the major candidates, capturing only about 10% of the vote. The results were a devastating rejection of military rule and ethnic politics, demonstrating that Central Africans were ready for fundamental change. Faced with this humiliating defeat, Colombo briefly attempted to have the elections invalidated by the Constitutional Council, but domestic and international pressure forced him to accept the results and participate in the runoff election. Ange Félix Patassé won the October 1993 runoff with 53% of the vote, becoming the first democratically elected president in Central African history. His inauguration represented a peaceful transfer of power from military to civilian authority, something that had never happened before in the country's tumultuous political history. For the first time since independence, there was genuine reason to hope that democracy might actually take root in Central African soil. The new president inherited a country in crisis that would have challenged even the most competent leader. The treasury was empty, civil servants were owed months of back pay, infrastructure was crumbling, and ethnic tensions were running high. More ominously, Patassé inherited a military that was dominated by Yakoma officers loyal to the former regime and suspicious of the new northern-led government. The stage was set for confrontation between democratic aspirations and entrenched interests. But the fundamental problems that had plagued the country since independence remained unresolved. The economy was still desperately dependent on primary commodity exports, which made government revenues vulnerable to fluctuations in world market prices. The education system was underfunded and inadequate, limiting the pool of qualified administrators. Most critically, the military remained divided along ethnic lines and unpaid, creating a constant threat to political stability. The first major crisis came in 1996, when soldiers began mutinying over unpaid wages and ethnic discrimination. The mutinies quickly escalated into broader conflicts between northern and southern ethnic groups, with the military essentially splitting along tribal lines. French troops intervened to restore order, but the underlying tensions remained unresolved. It was becoming clear that democracy was fragile in a country where ethnic identity often trumped national loyalty. The pattern of mutiny, foreign intervention, and temporary peace repeated itself in 1997. Each crisis weakened the government's authority and demonstrated the military's unwillingness to accept civilian control. International peacekeeping forces rotated through Bangui, first French troops, then the Inter-African Mission to monitor the Bangui agreements, and finally the United Nations mission in the Central African Republic. The country was becoming dependent on foreign soldiers to maintain basic order. Despite these challenges, Patassé was re-elected in 1999, demonstrating that Central Africans still had faith in democratic governance. However, his second term was marked by increasing authoritarianism and reliance on foreign military support. When faced with a coup attempt in May 2001 led by former President Kalimba, Patassé turned to Libya and the Democratic Republic of Congo for military assistance. The democratic experiment was becoming militarized and internationalized. The final crisis came in 2003, when Patassé's former army chief of staff, General François Bozizé, launched a rebellion from neighbouring Chad. Bozizé had been dismissed from his position in November 2001 and had fled the country after being accused of plotting against the government. From his base in Chad, he assembled a force of Central African exiles and Chadian allies to challenge Patassé's increasingly unpopular regime. On March 15, 2003, while President Patassé was attending an African Union summit in Niger, Bozizé's forces captured Bangui in a swift operation that encountered minimal resistance. The 10-year democratic experiment had ended with the same type of military coup that had brought it to power. Patassé fled into exile in Togo, while Bozizé proclaimed himself president and promised to restore order and prepare for new elections. The collapse of Central African democracy represented a tragedy not just for the country itself, but for hopes of African political development more broadly. Despite international support and genuine popular desire for democratic governance, the experiment had failed to overcome the structural problems that had plagued the country since independence. Ethnic divisions, economic underdevelopment, military indiscipline, and external interference had proved stronger than democratic institutions. Chapter 6: Contemporary Challenges and Future Prospects. François Bozizé entered the presidential palace in Bangui on March 15, 2003, with the swagger of a military victor and the promises of a democratic reformer. He pledged to restore order, fight corruption, and prepare the country for free elections. The fact that he had just seized power through armed rebellion seemed almost irrelevant to a population exhausted by years of civil strife and economic collapse. Once again, Central Africans were willing to give another strongman the benefit of the doubt, hoping that this time would be different. History would soon prove them tragically wrong. Born on October 14, 1946, in what was then French Equatorial Africa, Bozizé was the only Central African president born in modern-day Gabon. His early life followed the familiar pattern of military service and gradual advancement through the ranks. He had served under Emperor Bokassa in the 70s, worked as Minister of Defence after Bokassa's overthrow, and survived the political turbulence of the 80s and 90s through a combination of competence and adaptability. His rebellion against Patassé had been motivated as much by personal grievance as political principle. He had been dismissed as army chief and fled the country when accused of plotting against the government. Bozizé's initial years in power brought some hope for stability. A new constitution was approved by referendum in December 2004, and presidential elections were held in March 2005. Despite concerns about the legitimacy of a military leader organising his own electoral validation, international observers deemed the elections reasonably free and fair. Bozizé won decisively, giving him the democratic mandate he had lacked since his coup. For a brief moment, it seemed that the Central African Republic might finally break the cycle of military coups and authoritarian rule. But the fundamental problems that had plagued the country since independence remained stubbornly unresolved. The economy was still desperately dependent on diamond and timber exports, both vulnerable to international price fluctuations and corruption. The military remained unprofessionalized and divided along ethnic lines. Most critically, large portions of the country, particularly in the north and east, remained beyond effective government control. dominated by armed groups that operated more like criminal gangs than political movements. The state was hollow at its core, unable to provide basic services or maintain law and order beyond Bangui. The Central African Bush War, which had begun in 2004, escalated throughout Bozizé's presidency. The Union of Democratic Forces for Unity, led by Michel Djotodia, launched attacks from bases in Chad and Sudan, while other rebel groups emerged to challenge government authority. What had initially seemed like manageable insurgency grew into a multi-front conflict that drained government resources and terrorized civilian populations. Villages were burned, schools and hospitals destroyed, and hundreds of thousands of people displaced from their homes. The countryside became a lawless frontier, where armed groups competed for control of diamond mines and smuggling routes. Bozizé's response to these challenges revealed both his limitations as a leader and the broader weaknesses of the Central African state. His government relied heavily on foreign military support, first from Libya, then from Chad, and eventually from a controversial mix of French advisors and private security companies. Rather than building effective national institutions, he created parallel structures of power based on personal loyalty and ethnic affiliation. Corruption flourished as government officials, military officers, and business leaders enriched themselves through diamond smuggling, illegal logging, and arms trafficking. The president himself was later accused of taking millions in bribes from French mining companies. The religious and ethnic dimensions of the conflict became increasingly pronounced during Bozizé's presidency. As a Christian leader governing a predominantly Christian population, he was viewed with suspicion by the Muslim minority, who comprised about 15% of the population but had long faced discrimination and marginalization. Muslim communities complained of systematic harassment at roadblocks, difficulty obtaining government documents, and exclusion from educational and economic opportunities. These grievances provided fertile ground for recruitment by rebel groups that increasingly framed their struggle in religious terms. By 2012, multiple peace agreements had failed to bring stability, and Bozizé's government controlled little territory beyond the capital and a few major towns. The president's increasingly authoritarian tendencies alienated former allies, while his inability to pay soldiers' salaries undermined military loyalty. International partners grew frustrated with his failure to implement reforms or extend state authority. Most ominously, various rebel groups began coordinating their activities, forming alliances that would prove far more dangerous than individual insurgencies. The formation of Seleka in December 2012 marked the beginning of the end for Bozizé's presidency. The coalition, whose name means alliance in Sango, brought together 5 different rebel groups under the leadership of Michel Djotodia, a former civil servant who had been radicalized by years of marginalization and conflict. The mostly Muslim coalition included fighters from Chad, Sudan, and the Central African Republic itself, united by grievances against Bozizé's Christian-dominated government and motivated by dreams of political power and economic opportunity. The Seleka offensive began in the northeast and swept southward with stunning speed, capturing town after town as government forces either fled or defected. The rebels' advance was facilitated by popular anger at Bozizé's failures, foreign support from Chad, and the simple reality that the national army was too weak and demoralized to mount effective resistance. By January 2013, Seleka forces were threatening Bangui itself, prompting negotiations that produced the Libreville Agreement, a power-sharing deal that few believed would hold. The peace agreement collapsed within months, as both sides violated its terms and prepared for renewed conflict. On March 24, 2013, while President Bozizé was attending a regional summit in Niger, Seleka forces launched their final assault on the capital. The attack succeeded with minimal resistance. Government troops, many unpaid for months, simply abandoned their positions and fled. By evening, rebel fighters controlled the presidential palace, the airport, and key government buildings. Bozizé himself learned of his overthrow from television news while stranded in Cameroon, his return flight diverted when rebels shot at his approaching aircraft. Michel Djotodia declared himself president on March 25th, becoming the first Muslim to hold the office in Central African history. His rise to power represented a dramatic shift in the country's political landscape, but it also marked the beginning of an even more destructive phase of conflict. The Seleka coalition, which had held together during the rebellion, began fragmenting almost immediately after victory. Different factions pursued their own agendas, while foreign fighters who had joined the movement proved impossible to control or integrate into normal political structures. The months following Jotodia's takeover were catastrophic for ordinary Central Africans, undisciplined. Seleka fighters looted homes and businesses, killed civilians suspected of supporting the former government, and terrorized entire communities. The new president's attempts to restore order failed completely. He formally disbanded the Seleka coalition in September 2013, but most fighters ignored his commands and continued their rampage across the countryside. The state had effectively collapsed, leaving armed groups to compete for territory and resources without any meaningful central authority. The emergence of anti-Balaka militias in late 2013 transformed what had been a political conflict into a religious war. These self-defense groups, whose name meant anti-machete in local languages, were formed by Christian communities to protect themselves against Seleka attacks. Initially defensive in nature, they quickly evolved into offensive militias that launched systematic attacks on Muslim civilians, burning mosques, destroying Islamic schools, and forcing entire communities to flee their ancestral homes. The conflict had acquired a sectarian character that made reconciliation infinitely more difficult. By December 2013, the situation had deteriorated to the point where international observers warned of impending genocide. The coordinated anti-Balaka assault on Bangui on December 5th, dubbed "a day that will define Central African Republic," killed more than 1,000 civilians and brought the country to the brink of total collapse. French forces intervened with Operation Sangaris, while African peacekeepers deployed under international mandate. The intervention prevented complete catastrophe, but could not restore meaningful governance or stop the cycle of retaliatory violence that was tearing the country apart. Under intense international pressure, Michel Djotodia resigned in January 2014, admitting his failure to control the forces that had brought him to power. His brief presidency had lasted only 10 months, but the damage was immense and lasting. The interim government that followed, led by Catherine Samba-Panza, the first woman to serve as head of state, faced the impossible task of rebuilding institutions while managing an ongoing humanitarian crisis. Over 1 million people had been displaced, the economy had collapsed, and basic services had ceased to function in most of the country. The election of Faustin Archange Touadéra in March 2016 represented another attempt to restore legitimate government to the Central African Republic. A mathematics professor and former Prime Minister under Bozizé, Touadéra was widely seen as a technocratic compromise candidate who might be able to bridge the country's deep divisions. His victory in what were generally regarded as free and fair elections provided hope for democratic renewal, while his academic background suggested he might bring analytical rigor to the challenges of governance. Touadéra's presidency has coincided with gradual improvements in security and modest economic growth, but the fundamental problems remain largely unresolved. Armed groups still control vast swaths of territory, particularly in the north and east, while the central government's authority barely extends beyond major towns. The economy remains dependent on natural resource extraction, while most citizens live in poverty that would shock visitors from developed countries. Ethnic and religious tensions continue to simmer beneath a fragile surface, calm, ready to explode whenever political tensions rise. The president's increasingly close relationship with Russia has marked a significant shift in the country's international orientation. Russian military advisors and private security contractors have provided crucial support for government forces, while Russian companies have secured mining concessions and other economic opportunities. This partnership has helped stabilize Touadéra's government, but has also raised concerns about the country's sovereignty and democratic development. Critics argue that Russian influence represents a new form of neocolonialism, while supporters credit Moscow with preventing complete state collapse. Constitutional changes approved in 2023 have extended presidential terms from 5 to 7 years and eliminated term limits, allowing Touadéra to seek a third term in upcoming elections. Opposition groups have condemned these changes as authoritarian, arguing that they represent a step backward from democratic norms. The president's supporters counter that stability requires continuity of leadership and that the country cannot afford the disruption of frequent political transitions. The debate reflects deeper questions about whether democracy can take root in a country still struggling with basic governance challenges. The humanitarian situation remains dire despite improvements in overall security. Nearly a quarter of the population has been displaced by conflict, while millions more require international assistance to meet basic needs. The education system has been devastated, with thousands of schools destroyed or closed, leaving an entire generation without access to formal learning. Healthcare infrastructure is virtually non-existent outside the capital, while malnutrition rates remain among the highest in the world. These conditions perpetuate the cycle of poverty and instability that has plagued the country for decades. International efforts to support peace and reconstruction have achieved mixed results. The United Nations maintains a large peacekeeping force, while various donor countries and organizations provide humanitarian aid and development assistance. Peace agreements signed with armed groups have brought temporary ceasefires but have failed to address underlying grievances or create sustainable political settlements. The Special Criminal Court, established to prosecute war crimes and crimes against humanity, has issued numerous arrest warrants but has struggled to apprehend suspects or deliver justice to victims. Looking toward the future, the Central African Republic faces enormous challenges that will test its resilience and determination. Climate change threatens to exacerbate existing problems as shifting weather patterns affect agricultural production and increase competition for scarce resources. Population growth is outpacing economic development, creating a youth bulge that could either drive progress or fuel instability, depending on whether young people find meaningful opportunities. Regional conflicts in Chad, Sudan, and the Democratic Republic of Congo continue to spill across porous borders, while international criminal networks exploit weak governance to traffic drugs, weapons, and other illegal commodities. Yet there are also reasons for cautious optimism about the country's prospects. Civil society organizations have shown remarkable resilience, continuing to advocate for peace and human rights despite enormous challenges. Religious leaders from different communities have worked to promote reconciliation and counter extremist narratives. Women's groups have played crucial roles in peace processes and community healing. Most importantly, ordinary Central Africans have repeatedly demonstrated their desire for peace, democracy, and development, even when political leaders have failed to deliver on these aspirations. The story of the Central African Republic since 2003 illustrates both the fragility of post-colonial African states and the resilience of people determined to build better futures despite overwhelming obstacles. The country's experiences with democratic transitions, authoritarian reversals, ethnic conflict, and international intervention offer lessons for other societies struggling with similar challenges. Perhaps most importantly, they demonstrate that political solutions require not just changes in leadership, but fundamental transformations in institutions, attitudes, and relationships between different communities. As the Central African Republic approaches its 65th anniversary of independence, its future remains unwritten. The choices made by current leaders and citizens will determine whether the country finally breaks free from the cycles of instability that have defined its post-colonial history, or continues to struggle with the same fundamental problems that have resisted solution for generations. The stakes could not be higher for a nation that has endured so much suffering, yet retains so much untapped potential.